yes, my name is Michael Smith, the National Consumer Education Manager of Janome Canada, and back for another Ask Janome HQ. So what will we be primarily talking about today? But again, everyone feel free to ask questions. So yes, Ask Janome HQ. And again, it was about 2 weeks ago where Catherine said, I need help with my 1/4 inch. And I thought, oh, that's a perfect topic, is how to get a better 1/4 inch. So of course, Janome has so many options. So we'll talk about some options for the mechanical machines. And then of course, we'll talk about machines, more fancy machines like the 9mm ones. So, foot up for pivoting. Can I set this to always be on? I have a 12,000. Yes, your foot height for pivoting, actually, if you want your presser foot, is right at that icon there. So when we're doing our sewing and we're piecing, if we have a computerized machine, if we click this button here to turn yellow, that will automatically raise our presser foot when we stop sewing, and the needle will go down, just as the icon says, the needle will go down in the fabric. So then if it is selected, it's yellow, then we know it's on, and then to turn it off, then it's in blue. So that is your foot height for pivoting. And yes, you can turn that on and off. Oh, and Sanders here, perfect timing. So yeah, so when we're talking about our 1/4 inch piecing, many of our quilt blocks here, this is one of the blocks from the Lottie quilt that I have been sewing. Maybe many of you participated in Jennifer Tryon's quilt along earlier. Late last year is when we were doing it. I'm still behind, of course. But yes, all these half square triangles. So here is a square and it's cut in half. So we call these half square triangles. So all these seams, and then there's 3 blocks wide, and then there's the sashing strip, and then there's another 3 blocks. So all those piecing. So it's very important that we get an accurate 1/4 inch when we're putting all these pieces together. These blocks should ultimately finish about 21 inches. They're very big blocks. And then sure enough, boom, yes, mine finished exactly at 21 inches. Now, a lot of what determines your accuracy is, yes, what presser foot you use, you know, the thickness of your thread. You're generally, for most piecing, you're using maybe a 60 weight thread, or 50 is kind of average weight thread. But also your pressing really makes a big difference too. So the Lottie quilt pattern said to press all the seam allowances open. Generally, most of the time, we're pressing to one side, and we're usually, for half square triangles, for example, if there's a light fabric, we're generally pressing to the dark fabric, so we don't see the shadow on the light. But again, in our Lottie pattern, it said to press all the seam allowances open. So the one advantage of doing that is everything is nice and flat, and again, very accurate. So when we open them up, and again, your points are all beautiful and everything lies nice and flat, so pressing can definitely make a big difference of your 1/4 inch seam. So we'll definitely talk about that as we go along. So typically when we're sewing, and I know when I first started sewing, again 30 years ago, and we were talking about 1/4 inch, and I started getting into quilting, I would just butt up my fabric against the edge of the presser foot here. That's what I think most of us sort of by default think, oh yeah, that looks like a small 1/4 inch. I'll just use the 1/4 inch, or I'll just use the edge of my presser foot as my 1/4 inch. Now you can see I've already done my line of stitching there, but when I take my measurement, this is one of my acrylic rotary cutting rulers, or if you have one of these little, you know, seam gauges there, and find your 1/4 inch and measure. When I put my line, so here is 1/4 inch from the edge, when I put my line down on my line of stitching, you'll see, oh no, that edge of the presser foot is way more than 1/4 of an inch. It's actually about 3/8 of an inch. So we can't use the edge of this presser foot for our 1/4 of an inch. But there's always alternatives. There's always options. So I find it the easiest thing when you're trying to line up your 1/4 of an inch, take your foot off, and then it's easier to see. And then lay your ruler down and gently turn your balance wheel towards you to then drop your needle down so it's right on or just hovering above that 1/4 of an inch line. So when you are So when you are, again, trying to measure, then your needle is right above that 1/4 of an inch line. And I see right about the side of my feed dogs here, in general, for most of our machines, right along that edge of that feed dogs is that 1/4 of an inch. So it's always good to measure. So when we do that, then we see, okay, it's about in line where that feed dog is. So you could use many things. Painter's tape is your friend. I always have a roll of painter's tape in my sewing room. So I could, right up to the edge of that feed dog, I could run the painter's tape down. So that will give me that accurate 1/4 of an inch. So then I would line it up, again, line up my fabric with the edge of that painter's tape, and then as I stitch along, again, I know that would be very accurate. So we could do that. Maybe you already have some painter's tape at home. But if not, you know, Janome has this fabulous cloth guide. I've demoed this so many times on our various presentations, and it comes with, there's 2 size screws. One is longer than the other. And it is for either you have a hole in your needle plate or maybe you have a hole in the bed of the machine, as this one is here. And then I'm going to use the longer screw if the machine has a hole in the bed of the machine. So I'm going to screw this in. There we go. So here, and again, it's just easier with the foot off, that, oh, there I could line up with that 1/4 of an inch. So then that would help us with an accurate guide. So if we can't use this foot because, oh no, that's not going to fit, then perhaps from your Janome dealer, either included with your machine, there may be another fit, a foot that will fit, or again from your Janome dealer, perhaps you could get, like maybe this F2 open toe foot, that may work lined up. And I see in this case, oh no, it won't work. But there are other feet that you could get a 1/4 of an inch foot for your machine, and that will line up exactly with that 1/4 of an inch. So it really depends, again, what is included with your machine or what you can, again, get from your Janome dealer. So there's many different options. So the use of that cloth guide can definitely help. And again, with the correct foot that is thin enough, so that will work well. But if we're sticking with, oh, well, what's included with the machine? Again, this is an optional accessory. So what's included with the machine? Well, included with this beautiful Janome 234 is this blind hem foot. Now, it's for a blind hem, and I demoed that many times on Janome's Magical Machine Mystery Tour. But how about we snap it into place? And again, we use our ruler here. I've got my needle down on my line, and there is an adjustable guide here at the side for our blind hem. So we can move this guide to the edge of our ruler. And then again, we're always going to do test samples. So when I line that up, that, oh yes, I haven't moved my needle. It's on regular straight stitch of what our machine is set at, the default straight stitch. And again, see how you can adjust your machine reading your instruction manual. And again, maybe you can adjust your machine to move the needle, but in a lot of times with these mechanical machines, that they're pre-selected stitches. Again, I only have these pre-selected stitches, so I can't adjust my needle, one by one. So right now it's on A, which is like center needle position. Now I set my stitch length at number 2. Now personally, when I do my piecing, again, I like to have a tighter stitch. So that's why I reduce the stitch length, because then I don't backstitch when I do my piecing. So it's nice to have a tighter stitch. So then there is my seam, and then when I take my ruler back up against the fabric and I lined that 1/4 inch line up against, it's laying on top of the stitches. Boom, look at how accurate that is, right along the edge. Like that is perfect. So this foot, again, is the blind hem foot, but I can adjust it to, all of a sudden it becomes a 1/4 inch piecing foot. So I don't need to worry about getting an extra foot necessarily. Although we do have some 1/4 inch piecing foot that again has a guide, that this is an optional accessory, again, that works on most machines. This one is for 7mm, so it doesn't quite line up here on my 5mm machine. So that's why I thought this is perfect, and it comes included. So yes, boom, there's your accurate 1/4 inch seam. It is so perfect. Now, this quilting attachment kit comes with many of our 7mm QDC machines, and there it does have the 1/4 inch foot with the guide, so that works out well. But also, again, maybe we could use this, the F2 foot is the open toe satin stitch foot, but we'll show on our other machine here that yes, you could even use this machine for your 1/4 inch. So there's always about options. And then also in this quilting attachment kit, again, it comes with that cloth guide, but that cloth guide does come separately. So that is an option that you could use up as well. So yes, when I switch here to my Continental M7, well, of course, with the 9mm machines and the computerized machines, oh yes, we have lots of options, of course. Now, but as I mentioned, as we're doing our 1/4 inch seaming, I find one of the best exercises to do to make sure that you're seaming and you're pressing, because pressing will definitely make a difference. So test your seaming and your pressing. What I have done is cut 3 2.5 inch wide strips, and I pieced them all together and pressed them. And then I take my larger ruler and measure them to see, is my stitching accurate and is my pressing accurate. So when we take 3 2.5 inch strips and we piece them together, again, we're going to be losing a 1/4 inch on this blue piece. We're going to be losing a 1/4 inch on this pink piece. We're going to be losing another 1/4 inch on this pink piece and another 1/4 inch on this blue piece. So collectively, there's 1/2 inch here and 1/2 inch here. So then we're losing 1 inch on this 2.5 and 2.5 and 2.5 inch strip. So you need to do a little bit of math. But what that should work out to be then, when these seam allowances are subtracted, is 6.5 inches. So when I lay my ruler down and I see, oh, that's not quite 6.5 inches, that is 6 1 2 3/8. So that's actually just a little shy. Here is my 4/8 would be 1/2 inch. So it's just a little shy. So one thing could be to adjust your seam allowance. The other thing, maybe you want to switch to a finer thread. Now, thread is weird in that the higher the number, the finer the thread. So a 50 weight thread is your average sewing thread, but maybe you'll switch to a 60 weight for your piecing. Or I know some quilters even love an 80 weight. It's a very fine thread, so therefore they're not going to lose a lot in the seam here because that thread is finer. But again, pressing makes a big difference. If you'll see, I've got the seam allowances pressed towards these the middle pink strip here. And again, this was 6 3/8. This piece, however, when I measure it, oh look, it is perfect at 6.5 inches. I used the same thread, the same needle, the same seam allowance. All I did was I pressed these seam allowances to the blue. Whereas this, again, I pressed them to the pink. So this, when the seam allowances were pressed inward, came out smaller. When I pressed the seam allowances outward, here on the right, it came out perfect. So again, sewn on the same seam allowance with the same thread, same needle. It just, how you press it can make a difference. And very often your patterns, if you're using a pattern, they've already worked that out for you. But again, just double check again to make sure when you're pressing as well. Notice I don't have any buckling in my fabric here, no folds in my fabric. When I press, I like to first set the seam the way it was sewn. So I put my iron here the way it was sewn and just press. Then I flip it over like this, and then I would move the edge of my iron out to press this seam flat. And then that way I know I'm not going to end up with any kind of buckling. If I sew from this side, or when I press from this side, I can't always tell, oh, maybe I'm pressing a fold into my fabric this way. So I will press maybe from this side, but I always come back and I press from the top side as well to make sure, again, there's no little fold of the fabric, because each of these little folds of the fabric, each of these seams will eat up a little bit of your seam allowance, because again, as that fabric folds back to the right, so you're losing a little bit in that fold. That's why some quilters, again, like using a really fine thread, and that's why, again, your pressing can really make a big difference in your 1/4 inch seam. Now, again, as we talk about, as usual, time is going by. When we talk about, yes, our 1/4 inch, well, we've got so many options. So in our regular machines, again, center needle position here, did you know your regular A foot? Well, you could use that because, All About Crafts is here. Hello, hello. It's great to see you. Your regular A foot, did you know, it'll probably be easier for me to take it off. Your regular A foot, there's actually 2 little notches. There's a little notch right up here, and then right to the side where the plastic bit of this is my 9mm A foot, is our standard zigzag foot that comes on the machine. Right along where the plastic meets the metal, that's a little guide, and that is a 1/4 inch. This little guide up here would be slightly smaller than that. So it's good to experiment with whatever machine you have. Maybe your regular standard zigzag presser foot can use, maybe you can use that for your 1/4 inch. Now, also depending on your machine, perhaps you have some markings on your needle plate. Most Janome machines have markings on the needle plate. And in fact, even on our 234 that I had just shown, it has marking on the needle plate. So, Sandra is asking, any tips on how to iron your seam properly to keep accurate measurement? Sandra, yes, what I do, again, is set the seam, so I just press down. I don't actually iron back and forth. I just press down to set the seam. That helps kind of sink it into the seam allowance. And then I use the iron. It depends on which way I'm going to fold my seam allowance. If I wanted my seam allowance behind the white here, I would have it like this, almost opening like a hinge. If I want my seam allowance here towards the dark side, I would flip it around, so then I, again, open my strip up, or my block up like a hinge, and I just use the edge of the iron to gently open and press right along that seam. I'm not moving the iron all the way over here. I don't need to worry about pressing this edge. I just want to make sure this edge is flat. So I use the side of the iron and the weight of it just to gently open that seam and press along the seam. If I have a long strip, I press down and then lift up and move, and press down and then wait a couple of seconds and then lift up and move. I'm not actually ironing back and forth. I'm pressing down, lift, move, press, lift, move, on. And that way then you're not stretching this at a shape. Then it stays nice and accurate there. And then again, this is why it always helps, especially if you're doing lots of piecing, it always helps to then take your ruler and see these two squares are 4 inches each. And then when I seam them together, again, I'm going to lose 1/2 inch. So they should measure, they should measure 7.5 inches. So then I know, okay, yes, I'm accurate. If I find after I've pressed and they're a little wonky, then I know, I probably pressed something out of shape. So it's good to double check your work as you're going along. So again, yes, your 1/4 inch foot, perhaps, again, your regular standard zigzag foot, you could use and use them in conjunction. We've got 1/4 inch markings on our needle plate here. So you could use them in conjunction with your marking on your presser foot. But it's following along that little groove, that little mark of where the plastic meets the metal on the foot. So I've already stitched that out. So you can see again how well that worked. And when I take my ruler up against and line it up right on the line of stitching, that it's right at the edge of the fabric. So that worked out perfectly. If I wanted a slightly smaller seam, people ask about the scant 1/4 inch. Well, maybe that little tick mark that was up at the top of the machine, or top of the foot there's the little tick mark there. Maybe we could use that little tick mark. You never know until you try, so you have to experiment. So on this sample here, I did my 1/4 inch, lining it up with, again, where that plastic meets the metal, and then there is lining up that little tick mark up at the top of the presser foot, and then again that lines up, that lines up to our 1/4 inch markings on our presser foot, or on our needle plate. And then when I stitch that down, though, now I've already stitched, so I'm not going to continue, but when I stitch that down, then, it produced a very narrow seam allowance. Now, how narrow that is, again, we open it up, press it very well, and then we see what the measurement is. Again, it should be just a little bit bigger than 7.5 because we have a smaller seam allowance now. So when I measure on my fabric there, then, yes, it is bigger. It's just a little bigger than 7.5. It's not quite 7 and 5/8. It's sort of somewhere in between there. So depending on, again, your project, if you wanted that scant 1/4, then perhaps using that little tick mark, if your A foot has that little tick mark there, and you're using, again, center needle position, you haven't adjusted anything, you're just using the markings on your foot, and then maybe you're using some of the markings here on your needle plate. So again, always options. So with many of our machines, we have so many options. Again, we could even use either the F foot is the satin stitch foot, or the F2 with the open toe satin stitch foot. And if we snap these feet on, then we could, again, this open toe F2 foot gives me great visibility. So let me just get my other 1/4 inch here. When I line up, this is when for sure I'm going to use the marks on my patented needle plate here. I see 1/8 inch, over here is 3/8 inch, and right in between is that 1/4 inch. And there is a little tick mark on your bobbin cover and a little tick mark here on the needle plate itself. So when we line that up, and again, it's generally up by the feed dogs here, so I can line it up even there. And in this case, then it's like the groove, the lineup of my foot there is right along the edge of the fabric. So if I were to use this open toe F2 foot, I'd go back to my regular center needle position, and I would use this foot then as my 1/4 of an inch, as I have stitched here. So that works out beautifully. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the place now because then there's so many options. So again, that was with regular center needle. Now, for most of us, though, the easiest thing that we do is, oh yes, depending on your machine, we've got the quilting category of stitches here. So we can hit quilting, and then we have our regular, again, center needle position where, oh yes, we could move on our 9mm machines. We have 91 needle positions. So we could do that, or we could just select the 1/4 of an inch piecing stitch. Boom, it's done. Now, the great thing is, again, our needle has swung all the way over 9mm to the right. When you want your smaller seam allowance, that scant 1/4, you can either move your needle to the right or you can move your fabric to the left. So you can do one of two things. So here this has swung my needle all the way to the right. It's also shortened my stitch length, again, to 1.8 is generally what I like to do for piecing. Because again, I don't like the back stitching builds up, you know, the extra thread, and we want to make sure our seam allowances lay nice and flat. So that's why I don't recommend back stitching. But then there, you can see the needle has swung all the way over to the right. We would use this, our O foot. This one has no guide on the side. This is the same O foot, but it does have a guide on the side. So these are 1/4 of an inch presser feet. They either come with your machine or are available. Now, many times people have asked me specifically, oh, so be it, Quilter, hello, hello. Many times people have asked me specifically with your half square triangles here. And again, here's our half square triangle. With our half square triangle there, we typically are sewing on a diagonal or following a diagonal line. And many times people have asked, can we use the foot with the guide as we're doing our half square triangle? And the answer is, oh yes, of course we can. We're following along. Again, I drew a center diagonal line, and then I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side. Now, again, when we want to compensate for the fold of that fabric, I like putting the guide of my presser foot to the right of that line. So now I go and sew, oh look, our 1/4 of an inch. Isn't that perfect? So again, my guide is to the right of that line, so that produces a more narrow or again scant 1/4. So when you are going to then press as you sew, that again kind of sets your seam, and then when you open this up, you know, very gently, again use your, even a lot of times for in this case I just use my fingers too, and then you're going to measure what that square is, and then when I see, oh, that is down to 3 5/8, and then you can go back and double check your seam allowance there. When I line up, oh, I'll do my lineup of stitching here. So I can see, oh yes, you see I'm just a little shy of that 1/4 of an inch. So that, by having that guide or your mark, again on the right side, gives you that little scant 1/4 of an inch. So then your piece, again, you're compensating for the fold of that fabric. So then your piece ends up either the correct size or it ends up a little bit bigger. In this case, mine was, again, just a little bit bigger than 3.5. So let's say now I could square this up to 3.5. So that would be perfect. Now, again, the last thing I'm going to show is I'm going to lock my machine, because with some machines we have the ability to switch our needle plate to the HP needle plate, which is the high performance needle plate. Now, some people confuse it with the straight stitch needle plate that has a center hole, a left hole, and a right hole. This one only has that left hole. So we're going to snap that into place. Boom, it's done. So I'm going to also change out the foot holder. Now, I get many questions on, will the HP needle plate work in my machine? Well, we really prefer people to only use the HP needle plate in those machines that actually recognize it. Because now that I have secured that little HP foot on and unlock my machine, you can see that, oh, it has grayed out all the other stitches that are not compatible with this machine. It only can do those straight stitches. So this is why we prefer to use it, the HP needle plate, in machines that recognize it. Again, like 6700 and the updated version 1 and version 2 of MemoryCraft 15000, the 15000 Quilt Maker, 9400, 9450, Continental M7, even 6650 will recognize this needle plate when snapped in, and it orients your needle over to the right. Or over to the left, sorry. And this, again, we love it because this foot is that perfect 1/4 of an inch. It lines up with the 1/4 of an inch line that's on our needle plate up here and down here and down here. So it lines up perfectly. So this is where, when I do my half square triangles, oh, I could just line that foot right up against, and it just works so perfectly. And cut my threads. So many of us, again, if your machine is compatible with it, it either came with or it is an optional accessory for Indigo Skyline S9 or the updated original blue Skyline S9. The HP needle plate and a little HP foot is a optional accessory. So yes, then when I measure in between, look at that, how perfect that is. Ooh, maybe I'll hold it up. Again, in between, you want 1/2 of an inch because we've got our 1/4 of an inch on one side. So when I lay my ruler on, then there's my 1/2 of an inch lines on my stitch lines. There's my 1/4 of an inch down the center, and there's my 1/4 of an inch there. So that is perfect. So now when I cut them apart on this line and press them open, they're going to be perfect and lay beautifully flat. So this is how I was able to do this Lottie quilt with gazillions of half square triangles. It came out so perfectly. And again, there's many 1/4 of an inch options, but again, if you're able to use that HP needle plate and HP foot, it really works out great. But again, for years and years and years, of course, we've got the O foot with the guide that I personally love, or for those who don't like the guide, there is an O foot there. So that works out beautifully as well. Now, Janome is all about options. So yes, even if, as an optional accessory, we've got the Clear View quilting foot and guide set. So this is a clear foot because some people don't like the metal feet. They'd rather have a clear foot with more visibility. So this is an option, this OV foot for 9mm machines. Whoops, 9mm, the blister pack. Now there is a 1/4 of an inch guide that you could screw on, or it has the optional, this is a ditch quilting guide that, again, you loosen that little screw and put that in there. So how perfect that is. Another option is Clear View 1/4 of an inch seam foot. Again, 9mm. It only has that center hole. So this is where you can use it with your regular universal needle plate, or of course you could use it with your straight stitch needle plate because you have that center hole right there and then lined up at the side. So again, you've got many options available to you. These feet are optional accessories for the 9mm machine. Oh, and then of course the last thing I wanted to mention, or two things. Now this HP2 AccuFeed Flex Professional Grade HP2 foot is an option for those machines that are compatible with AccuFeed. It's like our walking foot on steroids, and it's also compatible with the HP needle plate. So we've got the standard, AccuFeed flex holder, but the HP2, it's got that skinny HP foot profile, but the power of AccuFeed. So this is available with some machines, but it's also available in a separate blister pack. So you could also use that for your 1/4 inch. But for those machines that are AccuFeed compatible with the dual foot holder, we have the OD foot, which has the 1/4 inch guide there. So then we can easily snap this out of place and snap this on, and then boom, from here we would use that 1/4 inch stitch to orient our needle over, and then we have this guide. So this foot I like using with this OD foot, this foot holder with this OD foot, when I'm sewing my binding on, for example, all those thick layers, I like using this to feed it, and I have that guide to butt my fabric up against. So that is available. And then the last thing I wanted to mention as well, again, I feel like, I was all over the place today, was so much on my mind. This foot that comes included, this blind hem foot that comes included with this 234, is very similar to the edge guide foot. Now this one is for 9mm, and you'll see, oh yes, they look very similar. This edge guide foot has the SE foot there, and it has all these little markings that can help you, again, move this adjustable guide. So you could use this. It's an optional accessories, again, for 9mm machines. They also have for a 7mm machine. So you could use this as well to get your accurate 1/4 inch. Or again, if you need that scant 1/4, just slightly move the guide in a little more, and that'll give you that scant 1/4. Same here on your needle plate. If you're following those 1/4 inch lines, for example, that's right up here, and then it's right here, and it's right here of your 1/4 inch line. If you want that scant 1/4, just back off your fabric a little bit so you can see more of your guides. Instead of having your fabric right up against the guide, just back your fabric off a little bit. And again, do your testing and then measure, press and measure to make sure that it's not too scant. They definitely don't want to shrink, too much. So again, there's all about options. You just have to play and experiment. So thank you everyone for joining me today. I definitely ran very long, but I will see you next week on Janome's Magical Machine Mystery Tour. And what will I be showing? I don't know. It's a mystery. So, thank you. Computer Grandma says I'm fabulous. Thank you. And Jeanette, hello. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for the vote of confidence. Thank you everyone for your patience. Again, things happen with live. That's the fun of live TV. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.